We're on Lot 1 of the Glasshouse Mountains. This is the first house in the Glasshouse Mountains.
The shed's a real tangible link to the working class story of Bankford House.
And it has been a challenge. At night you go home and you think, oh, how can we do this without damaging something?
This unassuming timber structure next to Bankford House in the Glasshouse Mountains has played many roles since it was first built. Sitting in boggy ground and damaged by termites and water, it was at risk of collapse. A decision was made to carefully restore it so that along with the house and other outbuildings, it could also be used to help show some of the day-to-day lives of early settlers.
The Bankford Shed it's a real snapshot of the history of the site. There's the 3 families that have been here on the site over the generations, and there's this story of adaptation and reuse of materials. The shed has evidence of at least 2 earlier buildings. It's got different timbers used with older nail holes, so it's definitely been reused from somewhere. It's just a little time capsule.
We'll take out another
see what we find.
Here. Yeah.
Before work can begin on the restoration of the shed, an archaeology team from the University of Queensland, led by Professor Jonathan Pragnell,
Hit the bedrock here.
take a look at what lays beneath it.
There had been a whole series of other buildings here when Bankford House was a Cobb and Co station. So we're here to investigate whether or not there is anything significant below the surface of the shed.
These 2 little artefacts that were found at about 10 centimetres down, they're the same colour, possibly the same print.
We've put archaeological pits into the central bay and the southern bay of the shed, and we've put some outside around the shed as well.
What I'm looking for is rusty nails or pieces of glass or any evidence that someone was once here.
We're finding lots of construction materials, and we're also finding things like chains associated with bullock driving. These are the stories of everyday Queenslanders. And for that reason, this place is heritage listed. It's on the Queensland Heritage Register. When we do this kind of work, we're doing it to add to that story of the heritage of the Sunshine Coast.
The base where a plate would sit on the table, this piece here, is where it sits.
There was always something to find. There was always some little thing. And there was always horses to feed or cow to milk. There was always something coming and going there. And just as kids, just exploring it was good fun.
Ethel Burgess is the great-granddaughter of the original owners of Bankford House.
I'm the daughter of Bill Burgess, who's the eldest son of Clementina and William Smith Burgess. And Clementina spent her whole life living here, working here and helping her parents after she left school. When she eventually got married, she married William Smith Burgess from Landsborough, and he just joined her here at Bankford House, and they spent the rest of their lives here.
Normally when you have historic houses, they relate to historic figures or important people, usually rich people. But this is telling a completely different story. This house is telling a story of working class people making a living in a fairly isolated spot 150 years ago, maybe more, and then the changes that occurred through time to this place.
For the 150th anniversary of the Bankford House Heritage Precinct and acknowledging that Cobb and Co connection back to 1868, there's a new interpretation plan across the precinct with a new display in the Mary Grigger Centre, new interpretation throughout the house itself, and then the big project was the restoration of the shed. So the shed, it was in a pretty poor state, and the idea is to bring back some of those farm implements and tools and agricultural equipment that was in the shed and bring those stories back in.
The shed's right here next to the house, and round in that veranda was our designated play area, and often we'd end up in the shed, round the shed, and we thought it was great fun. It was an old shed.
Employing the expertise of a builder and architect, work tentatively begins on the crumbling shed. When the rusted roof was removed, the shed was flooded with sunlight, revealing the delicate work ahead. Time had taken its toll on the timber panels. To capture the transformation, a time-lapse camera was installed above the site, taking a photo every half an hour of the restoration. Initially, individual boards were numbered so the shed could be reassembled board by board. But in order to ensure no boards were misplaced, a decision was made to keep the wall panels intact. The walls were then carefully lowered and kept on site to be rebuilt.
Are you going to rebuild the roof then? My name's Chris Clark, I'm the architect for the project, the Bankford House shed refurbishment. The building dates from 1935 when it was built, which doesn't seem that old, but it's part of the Bankford House site. The house itself, to our right here, dates from 1868.
The house was rebuilt in 1930, and it was in the 1930s that they rebuilt the shed, so whatever was left over from the house probably went to build the shed.
First observation was it's probably gone too far. For me personally, it's been quite a challenge because everything you touched on this, there was a complication further along or an implication as well. If you did the wrong thing, the whole lot could have fallen to bits, and the challenge then would be to try to put things back where they originally were. And because there's so much damage, you lose one weatherboard, finding out where it's gone or what. So that's why we tried to maintain it as best we could as it was, and then we've gone from there.
At some stage the building had feed lots or feed openings through here. At one stage it was used to house poultry, and at that stage we had at the back, and the back wall's gone at the moment as this wall is, but they'll be rebuilt. That back wall had a kind of a lean-to hopper which went out to the back, and that'll also be part of the work which is rebuilt.
My thinking is that it was just rebuilt when it needed rebuilding. The southern side was open, and that's where they fed the horses. That's where they cut up cow feed with the chaff cutter. The middle section was where feed that was stored in bags of chaff and things like that were in there, and that's where all the saddles and bridles and things were, and that sort of equipment. And then this open side was where Dad put his truck.
When Ethel's dad subdivided the property in 1964, her aunt and uncle, Mary and Jack Ferris, bought Bankford House and the shed with it. Jack died in 2002 at the age of 101 and was the last occupant of Bankford House. Like those before him, Jack also made do with the materials at hand. Jack's son Bill, an engineer at Queensland Printing, gave him these newspaper printing plates to construct doors for the shed. Like so many of the materials used on the shed, the plates capture another moment in time.
You can see when you look closely to them, there's all this blueprint, so that would have been run through a newspaper printing press to print the newspapers, and I think they're about 40 years old.
Once restored, these plates will again be a striking feature of the shed doors.
They made do with the sorts of materials that they had available to them, so that's why we're seeing gates being made with something like printing plates as a layer on the outside rather than something a bit more conventional.
The methods used to originally build the shed would have been basic by today's standards.
Oh, they're very resilient, obviously, to be able to, they didn't have nail guns, they didn't have anything, and we've tried banging nails in by hand or just with a hammer. It's been impossible. It's so hard, the timber's so hard. Well, those days, they belted in 4-inch nails.
So 5 mil.
The shed was originally built lower than its surrounding ground, causing water damage to the timber and putting the whole structure at risk. To ensure its survival for the next century, it had to be rebuilt 300 millimetres higher.
Because of the building being built over several different periods of time, some of the weatherboards are different, so we're able to pick that up as the building went. So the weatherboards that run along these sides that were done in 1966, they're a slightly different shape to the ones which date from 1935. But they're all hardwood, and they would have been grown and cut quite near here.
The original allocation to replace timber on this was going to be almost a 50-50. But I think over the build we've probably saved a good 80% of what was here. We've tried to keep it as original as possible so the public can see this is what it was.
As well as being built higher off the ground, termite protection was added to protect the century-old timber from further decay. Once the walls were back in place, the timber was treated and a new roof was put onto the shed. With the roof, walls and floors finished, the restored printing plates were returned to the front gates. And with the building now watertight, farming implements and tools were put on display.
Hopefully people will be able to have a very good picture of how this site used to work, what it was like as a farm, as the family who ran it, also its history of how it interacted with all of the people who came past, with the Cobb & Co coaches, all of the local community and the Sunshine Coast people in the bigger picture.
After starting life in the 1930s using leftover wood from the other original buildings on site, the humble Bankfoot House shed now has a new life in the 21st century as part of the interpretation of the precinct.
On behalf of the people of Sunshine Coast and in the presence of the Governor, we'll declare this building reopened. Well done. Congratulations.
I think it's great that the whole place is being preserved. I mean, who else gets their grandparents and their great-grandparents' house put aside like this and having people come through it and it being the history of the area? I feel very privileged.
It was really important to restore the shed because it was in grave danger of falling down, and to interpret it as per its original purpose. So it was a shed, it was where farming implements were, it was where the animals were, it was where the tinkering happened on the property. So just to put some of those stories back into context and add another page to the Bankfoot House story.